Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and finally we are at the end of my 2020 wrap-up videos. Today we're going to talk about my favorite books that I read within 2020. All the other videos that I've done in this series, my 2020 stats, as well as looking back at my 2020 goals, my most disappointing, my most surprising, and my worst reads of 2020. I have put all of them into a playlist, and that playlist is linked down below and up there. So if you still have to check out any of those videos, go and look at that playlist. But today, as I said, we are going to talk about the best books I read in 2020. I have 13 books right here next to me. Some of those books I have actually already talked about in my most surprising books of 2020 video, and I won't talk closely about those books again. However, this list is in order, so I'm going to start with the book that I enjoyed the least of my best books, ending with the book that is my favorite book of 2020, and I will just quickly mention the books that were already in my most surprising books of 2020 list, just to tell you at which place within the list of my best books they are, because as I said, I split my best books list because I didn't want this video to get too long. And on that note, let's get started. And so let's start with my least favorite of my favorite books of 2020, which is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is his debut novel. He has previously already published poetry collections, however this is his first foray into prose, but you can still within the writing style really tell his background is in poetry, because the writing style is, oh my god, it is so immaculate and absolutely beautiful. And if I was judging purely by writing style, this book definitely would be #1 of 2020, because oh my god, I cannot tell you how beautiful it is. And this book is around 200 to 250 pages long only, but it took me really long to read it because I would only read 10 to 20 pages a day, because I just wanted to savor reading it and to just read it in very small and short increments to get the most out of the writing style. But anyway, what is this story about? This story is kind of written as a letter from a son to his illiterate mother. And on the one hand, it tells the story of the mother who immigrated from Vietnam to the US. And on the other hand, it tells the story of the son who grew up as a Vietnamese immigrant in the US, but also as a queer kid. And it deals with themes of war, of immigration, it deals with themes of trauma, it deals with themes of growing up, of queerness, of growing up queer, of growing up as a queer immigrant. And so there's a lot of really deep and hard-hitting themes within this story, and those themes definitely did touch me a lot. And oh my god, it's so beautifully written. I cannot tell you how beautifully written it is. In fact, I think it would be much higher on this list if it weren't for one little fact, and that is that when I made this list, I mostly went by my personal enjoyment of a book. And of course, a beautiful writing style brings me a lot of enjoyment. An artistically well done book brings me a lot of enjoyment. But a big part for me when enjoying a book also is that, it sometimes doesn't just have to touch me, but it has to personally touch me to really enjoy this book. And actually later on in this list with a comparison, I can more accurately tell you what I mean when I say I'm touched by a book versus when I say I'm personally touched by a book. Because for me personally, there were no points from my own experience, from my own lived experience, where I could latch onto the story of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. However, I also have a friend who lent me this book. This is in fact the only book that I do not own physically because I borrowed it from them. But that friend just had checked all the boxes of latching onto this book and of being deeply personally touched by this book. And to be honest, on its own, it's already amazing that even though I didn't feel like I could personally resonate at all really with the book, I still felt so deeply touched by it. I still found it so absolutely amazing and beautiful that I still absolutely felt the need to give it 5 stars, because usually I don't do that with books that I don't personally feel touched by, and that I still absolutely 100% knew this book has to be on my best of 2020 list. So yeah, I can just say, everyone, even if you cannot resonate with the experiences within this book, everyone go and read it. So now I've already talked a long time about the first book, so let's hope I'm gonna get a little bit quicker with the other books. But the second book I have on my list is Orphea by Joanne M. Harris. This book is a retelling of the Orpheus myth, but instead of a husband going in search for his wife, you instead have a mother going in search, going to the underworld to get back her daughter who committed suicide. So there are trigger warnings for suicide. But mainly the story is just absolutely beautifully written and deals a lot with themes of course, death, but especially grief, and especially a mother's grief at losing her child. And there's just sequences within this book. As you can see, I tabbed it a little bit. I don't usually tab books, but I absolutely 100% felt the need to tab this one, because you know, it's just so incredibly beautifully written, with just sequences and paragraphs within this book, within this story, that just hit so incredibly hard that just I don't know how to put it into words. And I did do a spoiler-free review of this book, so I will leave that review linked down below and up there, so go and check it out if you haven't yet. But I can highly recommend picking up Orphea. Then we have a book I already talked about in my most surprising reads of 2020, so I won't talk about what this book is about. I will just mention it, that it's at this point within this list, and that is The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse by Charlie Mackey. Then on my number 10 spot I have The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is the final part of The Lord of the Rings. And I finally finished The Lord of the Rings. And I am so happy I finally did. I cannot wait to do a proper reread of the entirety of the trilogy. I know it wasn't planned to be a trilogy, but you know, it was published as one. But anyway, I cannot wait to do a proper reread, reading the books back to back, because I did leave quite a lot of time pass between each of the entries in the series. And yeah, I read the German translation, but still Tolkien's writing style and Tolkien's way of like telling a story is so beautiful and so amazing. And whoever translated to Lord of the Rings did an absolutely stellar job. Usually I absolutely hate fantasy translations or like German translations of fantasy books. However, The Lord of the Rings is just one of the best translations of a book ever done, probably. And yeah, aside from that, it was hard for me sometimes to not constantly have the movie in the background, because the movies are some of my favorite movies of all time. And I absolutely love them, and I have of course seen them a lot already before I ever read the book, so it was kind of hard to push them to the side. But with The Lord of the Rings, I definitely, and I think that's like such a compliment to both the book and the movies, I think you cannot really say which is better. I think the movies are amazing adaptations that cut what had to be cut, but that also sometimes changed what had to be changed. For example, within this story, you of course have the final battle, which actually I was surprised that it was so short, because of course the third movie is mostly comprised of the final battle, and that was definitely necessary to like lengthen that, because Tolkien doesn't spend a lot of time on his battles. And also some of the emotional scenes are actually better done in a movie, I think, than in a book. However, overall the storytelling, I would say, is better in the book. And so I think it just comes down to your preference, whether you prefer the Lord of the Rings books or the movies. But I think they can both stand on their own really well. But why am I talking about the movies? I should be talking about this book. But yeah, I just absolutely loved the finale of The Lord of the Rings. I found Tolkien's writing style to be absolutely beautiful. You do not get writing styles like that within modern fantasy anymore, and I know that it's sometimes hard to get into, but once you open your mind towards it, it's also just such a delight to read it. It's just so amazing and beautiful, and it's just its very own experience, and that's why this is on the list. Then next we have a book, or rather a series, that I also already talked about in my most surprising books of 2020 list, and that is The Band by Nicholas Ames. And I won't talk about this again, as I said, just with the boy, the mole, the fox and the horse. However, what I did want to mention with this is that this is the best example of me just saying, you know, this list wasn't necessarily done in a way to talk about the most beautifully written books or just the best books, like definitively the best books of 2020, but it's more just a list of the books that I most enjoyed within 2020. Because actually this is the only book slash series that I did not give 5 stars that's on this list. I only gave it 4 stars. However, both of the books I gave 4 stars. However, it's still higher because just from pure enjoyment levels, I did enjoy it more than the other books I talked about earlier. On my number 8 spot, I have a book that might surprise some people that it's this low, considering it's written by one of my favorite authors of all time, and that is Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, which is the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive series. And for the first time ever, I'm gonna try to summarize the Stormlight Archive series. The Stormlight Archive series is basically a series set in a world that is on its way towards the apocalypse, basically. And so you follow multiple characters as they fight in this war that has broken out a few years ago, that is a war of revenge to revenge this king that was assassinated by these other people. And you basically follow a bunch of characters that get more with each book, like the POV characters get more with each book, as they first of all find out that the desolation, which is the apocalypse in this world, is coming, but also try to fight this war. And so yeah, that's basically the basic gist of the story. And I did really enjoy this book. However, the reason why it's not as high on this list is because it is one of my less favorite books within the Stormlight series so far. It's my 3rd favorite out of 4, and so I felt like I couldn't really give it like a higher spot on this list, but I still really loved it. I also have a spoiler-free review of this book, so if you want to know my more specific thoughts on the series, on this book, I will leave the link down below and up there. And I also have a vlog that was split into 2 parts, a spoiler-free vlog that I did while I tried to read this chunky 1230 page book in 24 hours. So I will also leave that vlog link down below. So on my number 7 spot, I have Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which is kind of ironic considering Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia was on my worst books of 2020 list. But anyway, this is kind of a historical fantasy set in Jazz Age 20s Mexico. And this book is also heavily inspired by Mayan mythology. And we follow our main character, who is called Cassiopeia, who is kind of treated as a servant by her family. However, one day as she's cleaning her grandfather's closet, she kind of opens this box. And because she opens this box, her like soul, destiny, well, whatever you want to call it, she's now connected to the Mayan god of death, and she has to help him kind of find some of his lost body parts again so he can reclaim the throne of the Mayan underworld. And I absolutely adored and loved this book. I found the writing style to be absolutely beautiful. The themes in this story were mostly, like, on the one hand kind of belonging, but on the other hand there were a lot of themes that were just surrounding storytelling, fairy tales, legends, stereotypes. And Silvia Moreno Garcia played with those stereotypes, but also kind of subverted them sometimes. Then the writing itself, the storytelling itself was absolutely beautiful. I loved our main character Cassiopeia. I loved the relationship she had with the god. The development of that relationship was, again, beautifully and amazingly done. And I also have a spoiler-free review of this book, so I will leave the link down below and up there if you want to go and check it out. Another book I already had on my most surprising of 2020 list was The Shadowed Sun by N.K. Jemisin, which is the second book in the Dreamblood duology. I had the entire duology on my most surprising books of 2020 list. However, I didn't find that the first book, The Killing Moon, quite, you know, was worth putting onto this list, because while I did enjoy it a lot, I didn't like absolutely love and adore it as much as I did the second book, which is The Shadowed Sun. And again, I won't talk about my thoughts on this book. If you want to know my thoughts, go and check out my most surprising books of 2020 video, or go and check out my duology review, which I have done of the Dreamblood duology, which will be left down below. Did I'll get it out. Wow. We're down to my top 5 of 2020, and number 5 is The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. This is set on an island where sometimes things just disappear. And when something disappears, that doesn't necessarily mean that things literally disappear, but that just means that suddenly the people living on this island don't have any memory anymore of these things. And so they go out, they take those things and they destroy them, or they throw them away, or whatever. However, some people remember. Some people keep on remembering. By the way, if something has disappeared, for example, perfume, you can't smell perfume anymore as well. And so some people remember. So something was established that is called the Memory Police. And the Memory Police, first of all, make sure that the things that disappear stay disappeared, but they also try to find the people who remember. And so we follow our main character, who is a young author, a young novelist, and she finds out that her editor is one of those people who can remember, and she then tries to keep him safe from the Memory Police. I was so surprised that I absolutely loved this book as much as I did, because it was kind of an impulse pickup from my bookstore. I kind of really liked the cover of this book, so that's why I picked it up. But I, first of all, love the writing style. I love Japanese writing style. The way I kind of explained it in my review is that I find Japanese writing to be beautifully simple and simply beautiful. And if you're at all familiar with Japanese and modern Japanese design, you know that in a way it's very clean and it's very simple, but there's still so much complexity within that design. And you know, it's like the cleanliness and the simpleness of it reveals everything that is there. And that was what the case was with this book. It's just like the simplicity of the writing style just revealed everything that was within the story. And also I just loved the themes around memory that were explored within this book, like what even are we if we don't have our memories anymore, and so on. And I also do have a whole spoiler-free review of this book, so if you want to know all of my thoughts, all of my rambling around this book, go and check out that review. Then number 4 on my list is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is the first book in the Between Earth and Sky series, and I just love this cover so much. It's so beautiful. But anyway, this is a pre-Columbian Americas inspired epic fantasy series that, the most obvious influences that I personally can tell, but you know, I don't know a lot of pre-Columbian American cultures, but the most obvious influences I can see are mostly Aztec inspired and Mesoamerican inspired influences. And this series is so hard to explain, but I'm gonna try my best. We kind of have 3 different POVs. One of them is a sun priestess who, on the one hand is preparing for this big holiday, but on the other hand has to deal with conspiracies and people undermining her and politics and so on. Then the second POV is a young blind man who is on his way to the city where the sun priestess lives to kind of fulfill a prophecy, and the third POV is a young captain who brings said young man to said city. And so I really love this book. And it's kind of really hard to concretely say what I loved about this book so much. I first of all absolutely love the characters, I love the culture, I love the setting, I loved the way the world was described, but I also really loved the plot. I found this to be the perfect first book in a series where you kind of have your own plot within the first book that in a way is already concluded at the end, yet at the same time there's still enough left open that you want to know what continues on with the world, and you don't really know where it's gonna go, but you really want to know where it's gonna go. Does that make sense? Anyway, I hope I had a better success explaining what I loved so much about this series within my spoiler-free review, which once again will be left linked down below and up there if there's still space up there. The third spot on my best of 2020 list goes to Wunschloses Unglück by Peter Handke. The English translation of this, the English translation of the title, is A Sorrow Beyond Dreams. And this is the book where I was like, I can probably more accurately tell you what I meant with when I'm personally touched by a book versus when I'm just touched by a book. But first, what is this book about? This book is Peter Handke dealing with the suicide of his mother. And the way he did that was by writing down his mother's life story. And the way he did that was kind of by taking literary snapshots of his mother's life and just retelling his mother's life. And before I get into why I love this book, I do want to put a disclaimer that within Austria, this author is considered a problematic author. That is also the reason that aside from the wrap-up that I have talked about this book in, I have not mentioned this book since. And the reason why this author is considered problematic mostly has to do with politics in conjunction with the Balkan Wars and Serbian politics. But yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention that so that if you're interested in picking up this book, go and inform yourself on the author first and then decide whether or not you still want to read his works. But yeah, now that I mentioned that, why did I love this book so much? Nevertheless, that it still made it my number 3 spot on my best of 2020s list. This is the book where I wasn't just touched by the book like I was by On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, but where this book just really resonated with me. But not necessarily because of my own experience, but because a lot of the stories of this woman, of the mother of Peter Handke, reminded me so much of my own grandmother. This was written in the 70s, by the way, and so this is the story of a woman who was born before the Second World War, who lived through the Second World War, and then after the war lived in rural Austria, which Peter Handke is from Carinthia, my grandmother is from Styria, so like a different county, but the experiences still are very much the same, from the way the mother of Peter Handke acted to like little things like that she had to be taught that as a single woman it is okay to go into a cafe, which is something that my mother, for example, told me about my own grandmother, that it was really hard for her to tell my grandmother that after my grandfather died, she does not have to stay alone at home. It's okay for her to even alone go into a cafe and to like order a coffee and to drink something there and to meet friends. And just little things like that were so familiar to me, as I said, not because of my personal experience, but because of things I know from my grandmother. And because of that, this book was at parts really hard to read, even though it is as well a very short book. And so yeah, that's why I did decide to end up putting it on my best of 2020 list, even considering the problematicness of the author. Over my number 2 spot, we can go once again very quickly because I already mentioned it in my most surprising books of 2020 video, and that is The Invisible Life of Eddie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. And now that I mentioned this, let's go on to my number 1 spot. If you have been following me for the duration of most of the year, you might already know what this book is, because there is only one book that I have read in 2020 that I mentioned a lot during the year in multiple videos, tags, making extra videos and reviews about this book that I have not yet mentioned. And that book is, of course, the book that was the first 5-star read of 2020 for me, which is just kind of crazy that my best book is also the first 5-star that I read in 2020. It is one of the first books that I read within 2020, and that book is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is a Greek mythology retelling that tells the story of Achilles but through the eyes of Patroclus, and it kind of tells the story of how the two of them met, how they grew up together, how they came to mean so much to each other, and also of course the story of the Trojan War. And it just has everything. It has the beautiful writing and storytelling of Madeline Miller, which, like, Madeline Miller is just, she's an artist. She is like impeccable when it comes to her writing. It has action, it has emotions, it has tears, it has laughter and happiness. There's just everything you want in a good story and in a good retelling. Everything that you want from a book, from a story, is in this story. And so there really wasn't any other choice for me but to give my #1 spot of 2020 to The Song of Achilles, because this one is just the book that all around, from the writing to the story to the plot to the characters to my enjoyment, has everything. And I also have an entire review of this book, so I will leave the link down below and up there if there's still space. But yeah, that was my #1 book of 2020. And so tell me in the comments down below if you have read any of the books that I have talked about just now, and if any of those books maybe also made it onto your top list of 2020. Also, what are your books of 2020 that you enjoyed the most that maybe I haven't read or that weren't on this list? And with that said, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where we read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month, will also be linked down below, which I can highly recommend you join us, because 2 of the books that we read so far, 2 of the 4 books I think we read so far, made it onto this list. So, you know, we make good choices in which books to read. And I am sure that the book that we're currently reading, which is The Sword of Taigen by ML Wang, will also make it onto my favorites of 2021 list. But anyway, with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon, and bye.